Chapter 30. When you walk around like that, the heat and fatigue gradually throw your body out of balance. Though it's not quite illness, it feels as if your soul has moved into someone else's body. While speaking to Kay as usual, I found myself somehow detached from my usual state of mind. My feelings of affection or resentment toward him seemed to belong only to the trip and took on a temporary nature. In short, the heat, the tides, and the long walks had placed us in a new relationship, different from our previous one. We had become like traveling merchants thrown together on the road. No matter how much we talked, it never touched on the kind of complex intellectual issues we would normally engage with. We continued like that until we reached Choshi, but I still clearly remember a single exception during the journey. Before we left Bushu, we visited a place called Kaminado to see the Sea Bream Bay. I don't remember the details clearly, as many years have passed, and I wasn't particularly interested, but I recall hearing that it was the birthplace of Nichiren. According to legend, on the day he was born, 2 sea breams were washed ashore there. Since then, the village fishermen had refrained from catching sea bream, so the bay was said to be full of them. We rented a small boat and went out specifically to see the fish. I was focused solely on the waves. I gazed endlessly at the slightly purplish sea breams swimming in the water, finding it a fascinating natural phenomenon. But Kay, it seemed, was less interested in the fish and more absorbed in imagining Nichiren. There was a temple nearby called Tanjoji, likely named for being Nichiren's birthplace. It had a grand hall. Kay said we should visit the head priest. Honestly, we were dressed quite oddly. Kay had lost his hat to the wind and was wearing a straw casa. Our clothes were stained and smelly from sweat. I told him we should skip meeting the monk, but Kay, being stubborn, refused. He told me to wait outside if I didn't like it. With no other choice, I accompanied him to the entrance, convinced we'd be turned away. But the priest, surprisingly courteous, welcomed us into a grand hall and met us right away. At that time, my thinking differed greatly from Kay's, so I wasn't very interested in their conversation. But Kay kept asking questions about Nichiren. When the priest said Nichiren was nicknamed So Nichiren and known for his excellent cursive script, Kay, who was terrible at writing, made a scornful face as if to say, "What nonsense." Kay must have wanted to know something deeper about Nichiren. Whether the priest satisfied him in that regard, I don't know, but once we left the temple grounds, Kay began discussing Nichiren passionately. I, however, was too hot and tired to care, and only gave vague replies. Eventually, I found it too much trouble and fell completely silent. I believe it was the following evening. After arriving at our inn and finishing dinner, as we were getting ready for bed, we suddenly began discussing a difficult topic. Kay was still upset that I hadn't engaged with him about Nichiren the day before. He called people without spiritual aspirations fools and began to chastise me as if I were some shallow, frivolous person. But I had the matter of the young lady weighing on my chest, so I couldn't simply laugh off his insulting words. I began to defend myself. Chapter 31. At that time, I used the phrase to be human quite often. Kay said that in those words, I was hiding all of my weaknesses. Looking back now, I see that he was right. But since I used that phrase to justify myself and to make him understand what I thought was the inhumanity of his attitude, my starting point had already been rebellious. I had no room left for reflection. I insisted even more strongly on my argument. Then Kay asked me what part of him I considered not human. I told him, "You are human. You might even be too human, but your words make you seem otherwise, and you try to act as if you were not." When I said this, he only replied that perhaps others saw him that way because he was still lacking in self-discipline. He didn't refute me at all. Rather than feeling victorious, I felt sorry for him. I immediately dropped the subject. His tone, too, gradually became subdued. He said sadly that if I had known the ancients as he knew them, I wouldn't have attacked him like that. Of course, By the ancients, he did not mean heroes or warriors. He meant those who tormented the body for the sake of the spirit, or who whipped their flesh in pursuit of the way, the so-called practitioners of asceticism. Kei said explicitly that it pained him greatly that I could not understand how much he was suffering. After that, Kei and I simply went to bed. The next morning, we resumed our journey like regular travelers, sweating under the sun as we walked along. Yet the memory of that evening kept surfacing again and again in my mind. I burned with regret. Why did I let such a perfect opportunity slip by, pretending not to notice it? I thought it would have been better if, instead of using such an abstract term as to be human, I had spoken more directly and simply to Kei. The truth is, my feelings for the young lady were the very foundation for inventing such phrases. It would have been far more advantageous for me to expose the raw facts before him, rather than distill them into some artificial theory. The reason I couldn't do that was because the friendship between us had been built mainly on academic discussions. That created a kind of inertia in our relationship, and I lacked the courage to break through it. I confess that now. You could say I was too affected, or that it was pride that held me back. Either would be true, but the affectation or pride I speak of is a little different from the ordinary meaning of those words. As long as you understand what I mean, I'm satisfied. We returned to Tokyo tanned and dark. By the time we got back, my mood had already shifted again. All those petty arguments about what was or wasn't human had nearly vanished from my head. Even Kei no longer looked like a religious zealot. Most likely, there wasn't a single trace left in him of all that talk about spirit and flesh. The two of us, like strangers in a foreign land, stared blankly at the busy, bustling city. Then we went to Ryogoku and ate gamecocks stewed despite the heat. On that momentum, Kei suggested walking all the way back to Koishikawa. Since I was physically stronger than he was, I readily agreed. When we got home, the lady of the house was shocked to see us. We had not only darkened from the sun, but had lost considerable weight from so much walking. Still, she praised us, saying we looked healthier. The young lady laughed, saying it was funny how contradictory that was. Even I, who had occasionally been irritated with her before the trip, felt genuinely happy just then. It must have been the setting and the fact that I hadn't heard her laugh in so long. Chapter 32. More than that, I noticed a change in the young lady's behavior. After our long journey, we needed a woman's help in many things before we could fully settle back into everyday life. While the lady of the house attended to us as usual, the young lady seemed to prioritize me over Kei in everything she did. If she had done this blatantly, I might have felt awkward, perhaps even annoyed. But she was subtle and tactful, and that made me happy. In short, she directed her natural kindness toward me in a way only I could recognize. Because of this, Kei seemed perfectly unaffected by it. In my heart, I sang a quiet hymn of triumph over him. Soon summer passed, and by mid-September, we had to return to our school duties. Kei and I, due to our separate schedules, began coming and going at different times again. There were about 3 days a week when I returned later than Kei. But no matter when I came home, I never again found any trace of the young lady visiting Kei's room. He would always look at me with his usual expression and ask, "Just got back?" I would respond with a mechanical, meaningless nod. I believe it was around the middle of October. One day, I overslept and had to rush to school in my Japanese clothes. I didn't even take the time to tie up boots or anything and just slipped into sandals. According to the schedule that day, I was supposed to return home before Kei. So when I got back, I opened the lattice door without expecting anyone to be home. But I suddenly heard Kei's voice. Then I heard the young lady laugh. I wasn't wearing shoes that required time to take off, so I immediately stepped inside and slid open the partition. There was Kei, sitting at his desk as usual, but the young lady was no longer there. I only caught a fleeting glimpse of her back as she left Kei's room in a hurry. I asked Kei why he had come home early. He said he wasn't feeling well, so he stayed home. While I was sitting quietly in my room, the young lady came in with tea. That was the first time she greeted me that day, saying welcome back. I wasn't the kind of man who could joke and ask, "Why did you run away just now?" But inside, something about it nagged at me. She quickly left and went along the veranda to the other side of the house. She stopped in front of Kei's room and spoke a few words with him through the door. It sounded like a continuation of their earlier conversation, but since I hadn't heard the beginning, I couldn't make any sense of it. Gradually, the young lady's behavior became more relaxed. Even when both Kei and I were home, she often came to the veranda by his room and called out to him. Then she would enter and sit there for a while. Of course, she might have been delivering mail or dropping off laundry. Such contact between two people living in the same house would seem normal. But because I had a fierce desire to have her all to myself, I couldn't help but see it as more than that. There were even times when it seemed like she purposely avoided my room and only went to Kei's. You might ask, then, why I didn't ask Kei to move out. But doing so would have contradicted the original reason I'd brought him here in the first place. I couldn't bring myself to do that. Chapter 33. It was on a cold, rainy day in November. I returned home, my coat soaked, having walked up the narrow slope past the Kinyaku-enma as usual. Kei's room was empty, but the brazier there had been freshly tended, glowing warmly. I hurried to open the partition to my own room, eager to warm my cold hands. But in my brazier, there was only cold white ash, no ember left at all. I suddenly felt very displeased. Hearing my footsteps, the lady of the house came out. She looked at me standing silently in the middle of the room and gently helped me out of my coat and into dry Japanese clothes. When I mentioned I was cold, she brought Kei's brazier in from the next room. When I asked if Kei had already come home, she replied that he had come and gone again. According to the schedule, Kei was supposed to return later than I that day, so I found it strange. She said he must have had some errand to attend to. I sat reading for a while. The house was so quiet. Not a single voice to be heard, that the chill and loneliness of early winter seemed to seep into my very bones. I soon closed my book and stood up. I suddenly felt the urge to be somewhere lively. Though the rain had just stopped, the sky still looked heavy like cold lead. To be safe, I slung a paper umbrella over my shoulder and headed east, following the earthen wall behind the artillery factory. At that time, the roads hadn't been improved yet. The slope was much steeper than it is now. The road was narrow and not straight. And because the southern end of the valley was blocked by tall buildings and the drainage was poor, the street was always muddy. The worst part was the stretch between the small stone bridge and Yanagicho. Neither clogs nor boots were much help. You had to tread carefully. In the middle of this muddy path, I suddenly ran into Kei. Focused only on my footing, I didn't notice him until we were face to face. Surprised, I looked up and saw him standing right there. I asked where he had gone. He answered vaguely, "Just out for a bit," in his usual nonchalant tone. We passed each other carefully on the narrow strip of relatively walkable ground. Right behind Kei stood a young woman. My nearsightedness had kept me from recognizing her until then. But after passing Kei and glancing at her face, I was quite startled. It was the young lady from our house. She greeted me with a faint blush on her face. Back then, women wore their hair in a tight coil at the center of their head, without any bangs like today. I stared vaguely at her hairstyle for a moment before realizing that one of us had to give way. I made up my mind and stepped one foot into the muddy path, opening the better section for her to pass. After I made it to Yanagicho, I didn't know where to go. I felt as though nothing would interest me no matter where I went. I walked on aimlessly, heedless of the mud splashing up on me, and eventually made my way straight back home. Chapter 34. I asked Kei whether he had gone out together with the young lady. He answered that he had not. He explained that they had happened to meet by chance in Masego-cho and had returned home together. I had to refrain from probing any further. However, during dinner, I again felt tempted to ask the young lady the same question. Then she gave me that particular laugh I disliked. Eventually, she teased me, saying, "Guess where we went?" At that time, I was still rather hot-tempered, and being treated so frivolously by a young woman irritated me. But what struck me then was that of all those seated at the table, only the lady of the house seemed to take note. Kay, on the contrary, seemed unbothered. As for the young lady's behavior, it was hard to tell whether she was acting knowingly or if it was mere innocence. Though she was, as a young woman, thoughtful and composed, I couldn't help but feel she also bore those traits I disliked in women her age. And what's more, I had only started to notice those disliked traits since Kay had come to stay with us. I was unsure whether I should attribute this to my jealousy of Kay or view it as a calculated play by the young lady directed at me. Even now, I have no intention of denying that I felt jealousy at the time. As I've said repeatedly, I was fully aware of this emotion at the other side of love. Yet, to others, this emotion would seem to arise from trivial matters. Still, jealousy has a way of raising its head. As an aside, isn't such jealousy just the other half of love? After I married, I gradually noticed this emotion fading. But in exchange, the passion in my love also never again reached its former intensity. At that time, I began to think about laying my heart bare to the one I truly needed to speak to. Not the young lady, but her mother. I considered directly appealing to her, plainly requesting her daughter's hand. Yet even as I resolved to do so, I kept postponing the day I would act. I may seem indecisive by saying this, and I don't mind if I do, but in truth, my hesitation didn't stem from a lack of willpower. Before Kay arrived, what held me back was a fierce resistance to letting her fall into another man's hands. After Kay came, however, a new suspicion crept in, that the young lady might be leaning toward Kay rather than me. If she truly had affection for Kay, then I had resolved that this love of mine was not worth speaking aloud. It wasn't a matter of fearing embarrassment. No matter how much I loved her, if her heart belonged to someone else, I couldn't bear the idea of being with her. There are people in the world who, willingly or not, end up marrying the women they love and find joy in it. But I saw such men as either far more worldly than I, or simply too dull to grasp the psychology of love. At that time, I was too fervent to be convinced by such convenient philosophies as things will work out once you marry. In short, I was a noble theorist of love, and at the same time, the most roundabout practitioner of it. There were moments, during the long time we spent together, when opportunities arose for me to reveal my true feelings directly to the young lady. But I deliberately avoided them. At that time, I strongly felt that such things were forbidden by Japanese custom. But that alone wasn't what restrained me. I believed that Japanese women, especially the younger ones, lacked the courage to express their thoughts openly and without reservation in such situations. Chapter 35. So I stood paralyzed, unable to move in either direction. You know how when your body is unwell and you take a nap, you sometimes wake to find your eyes open and everything around you clear, but your limbs completely unresponsive? I secretly felt that kind of suffering now and then. Time passed, and spring came after the year's end. One day, the lady of the house suggested to Kay that he bring a friend over to play Karuta. Kay replied immediately that he had no friends, which greatly surprised her. Indeed, Kay had no one you could truly call a friend. He might exchange greetings with some acquaintances on the street, but none were people you'd play Karuta with. The lady then suggested I invite someone I knew, but I wasn't in the mood for such a cheerful game, so I gave a vague response and let the matter drop. That evening, though, Kay and I were finally dragged into playing by the young lady. Since no guests were coming, it was to be a quiet, private game with just a few of us. Moreover, Kei wasn't used to such games, and he seemed completely passive, as if just sitting with his hands in his sleeves. I asked him if he even knew the Hyakunin issue poems. He replied that he didn't know them well. Upon hearing this, the young lady, perhaps thinking I was looking down on Kei, took his side quite visibly. In the end, it was as if the two of them teamed up against me. If it had been someone else, I might have started an argument. Fortunately, Kei's attitude never changed from the beginning. Seeing no trace of pride or gloating in him, I managed to keep my calm and bring the game to a peaceful close. A few days later, the lady and the young lady left the house early in the morning, saying they were going to visit relatives in Ichigaya. Since school hadn't yet started, Kei and I were left behind like caretakers. I didn't feel like reading or going for a walk, so I simply rested my elbow on the edge of the brazier, propped my chin on my hand, and stared off, lost in thought. Kei made no sound in the next room, either. It was so quiet you might have wondered if we were even there. But that wasn't unusual between us, so I paid it no special mind. Around 10 o'clock, Kei suddenly opened the sliding door and looked me in the face. He stood on the threshold and asked what I was thinking about. Naturally, I hadn't been thinking of anything. If anything had occupied my mind, it was, as usual, the young lady. And of course, her mother came attached. Lately, Kei had also become inseparable from the problem, circling in my mind and making everything more complicated. As I looked at him, I couldn't bring myself to say out loud that I had vaguely begun to see him as an obstacle. I simply kept silent, still staring at him. Then Kei walked straight into my room and sat down in front of the brazier. I quickly pulled my elbows off the edge and, ever so slightly, pushed the brazier his way. Kei started talking in a tone uncharacteristic of him. He asked where in Ichigaya the lady and the young lady had gone. I said probably to their aunt's place. Kei then asked who this aunt was. I told him she was a military officer's wife. Then he asked why they'd gone out so early, when it wasn't even past the 15th, the usual time for women's New Year visits. I could only say I didn't know. Chapter 36. Kei wouldn't stop talking about the lady and the young lady. In the end, he began to ask questions so probing I could no longer answer them. I was struck less by the awkwardness than by the strangeness of it. When I remembered how he used to respond when I brought up the two of them, I couldn't help but notice how much his tone had changed. Finally, I asked why he was suddenly speaking of such things today. At that, he suddenly fell silent. But I noticed his lips trembling, as if he were trying to suppress something. Kei was a naturally quiet man. Even when he did want to speak, he had a habit of mouthing the words silently before saying them. The fact that his lips rarely moved without resistance gave weight to his words. Once his voice broke through, it carried twice the force of an ordinary person's. As I watched his lips, I sensed that something was about to be said, but I had no inkling of what it might be, so I was completely taken aback when he confessed his painful love for the young lady. I felt as though I had been turned to stone by a magician's wand. I couldn't even move my lips. At that moment, I became a solid lump, whether of fear or agony. I can't say, but a lump nonetheless. From head to toe, I went rigid like stone or iron. Even the flexibility required to breathe seemed to leave me. Thankfully, that state didn't last long. After a moment, I began to feel human again and immediately realized my mistake. He had beaten me to it. But I couldn't think of what to do next. I probably didn't have the capacity to think that far ahead. Sweat began to creep out from under my arms, soaking my undershirt, but I remained frozen in place. Kei, meanwhile, began to speak. Slowly and deliberately, confessing his feelings. It was unbearable. I imagine my pain must have been plain as day, as if the words were written across my face in large, clear letters. Even Kei must have noticed. Yet he was so immersed in what he was saying that he had no attention to spare for my expression. His confession was consistent from beginning to end, slow, heavy, and nearly impossible to stop once it started. While half of me listened, the other half was in turmoil. What should I do? What could I do? I was too distracted to catch the finer details, but the tone of his voice echoed powerfully in my chest. It wasn't just painful anymore. It was frightening. I began to feel that he was stronger than I was. When he had finished, I couldn't say a word. I didn't stay silent because I was weighing whether to confess my own feelings or not. I simply had nothing to say, nor did I want to say anything. At lunch, Kay and I sat across from each other. The maid served us, and I choked down a tasteless meal. We barely spoke a word. I had no idea when the lady and the young lady would return. Chapter 37. From that point on, we each withdrew into our respective rooms and didn't see each other again. Kay remained as calm as he had been that morning. I sat still, lost in thought. I felt it was only natural that I should confess my feelings to Kay. However, I also felt that the moment to do so had already passed. Why hadn't I interrupted him earlier and counterattacked? That now seemed like a critical blunder. At the very least, if I had spoken right after Kay finished, expressing my feelings on the spot, it might have been better. But now that his confession was complete, it seemed odd for me to suddenly bring up the same matter. I didn't know how to overcome this unnaturalness. My head swam with regret. I wished Kay would again slide open the partition and burst into my room. To me, what had happened earlier had been a complete surprise attack. I had not been prepared for it at all. I harbored a hidden hope of reclaiming what I had lost that morning. So I kept glancing up at the partition door. But no matter how long I waited, it never opened. And Kay remained silent as ever. Eventually, this silence began to disturb me. I couldn't stop wondering what Kay was thinking on the other side of that sliding door. Normally, even when we were quietly separated by that thin partition, I could forget about his presence entirely if he was quiet. So I had to admit that something inside me was truly unsettled this time. Even so, I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Having missed the chance to speak, I had no choice now but to wait for him to make the next move. At last, I couldn't sit still any longer. If I forced myself to remain still, I felt like I'd dash into his room. So I stood up and stepped out onto the veranda. From there, I entered the living room, poured hot water from the kettle into a teacup, and drank it, without any real purpose. Then I went to the front door. I deliberately avoided passing by Kay's room, and that's how I found myself out in the street. Of course, I had no particular destination. I simply couldn't stay still. So without concern for direction or purpose, I wandered aimlessly through the New Year's streets. My mind remained filled with thoughts of Kay no matter how far I walked. I wasn't trying to shake him off. On the contrary, I was roaming around while actively chewing over his image. First and foremost, he struck me as an incomprehensible man. Why had he suddenly confessed to me like that? And how had his feelings intensified to the point that he had to confess? Where had the usual, calm Kay gone? These were all difficult questions for me to grasp. I knew how strong he was. I also knew how serious he was. I believed that before deciding how to act, I had a lot to learn about him. At the same time, I found the idea of facing him again to be somehow eerie. As I wandered the streets in a daze, I kept imagining his face sitting quietly in our room. Yet no matter how far I walked, I heard a voice inside telling me it would never stir him. In short, he seemed like some kind of demon to me. I even felt as if I might be cursed by him forever. When I returned home, exhausted, his room was as quiet and lifeless as ever. Chapter 38. Not long after I got home, I heard the sound of a rickshaw. In those days, rubber tires weren't common, so the harsh clatter echoed clearly even from a distance. The rickshaw soon stopped in front of our gate. I was called for dinner about 30 minutes later. The festive clothes of the widow and her daughter were still strewn carelessly in the next room, coloring the space in disarray. They had hurried back because they didn't want to seem inconsiderate by being late for dinner. But their kindness meant little to Kay or me that evening. Sitting at the table, I greeted them curtly, like someone unwilling to speak. Kay was even more taciturn than I was. The two women, returning from their outing in high spirits, appeared even more cheerful than usual, which made our behavior all the more noticeable. The widow asked me if something was wrong. I replied that I felt a bit unwell. In truth, I did feel ill. Then the daughter asked Kay the same thing. He didn't say he felt sick like I did. He only said he didn't feel like talking. She pressed him, asking why he didn't want to talk. I happened to glance up at his face out of curiosity, wondering what he would say. His lips trembled slightly, as they always did. To someone unfamiliar, it would have seemed like he was merely struggling to answer. The daughter laughed and said he was probably thinking about something difficult again. Kay's face turned slightly red. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. Concerned by my comment at dinner, the widow brought me some soba broth around 10, but my room was already pitch dark. She said, "Oh dear," and slid the partition open just a crack. The lamp on Kay's desk cast a faint diagonal glow into my room. It seemed Kay was still awake. The widow sat by my pillow and told me to warm up, as I had probably caught a cold, then thrust the teacup near my face. I had no choice but to drink the thick soba broth in front of her. I stayed awake in the darkness, thinking until late. Of course, I was just turning over the same problem in my head, with no result. Suddenly, I wondered what Kay might be doing next door. Half unconsciously, I called out, "Hey." He replied with a hey of his own. Kay was still awake too. I asked through the partition, "Not sleeping yet?" He replied simply, "About to." I pressed again, "What are you doing?" This time, he didn't answer. But after 5 or 6 minutes, I heard the sound of the closet sliding open and bedding being laid out, as if it were happening right next to me. I asked what time it was. He replied, 1:20. Soon after, I heard the sound of him blowing out the lamp, and the whole house fell into silence and darkness. But my eyes only became sharper in that darkness. Again, in a half-unconscious state, I called out, "Hey," to Kay. He replied just as he had before. I then brought up what he had told me that morning and asked if we could talk about it more. If he was okay with that. Of course, I didn't intend to have such a conversation through the partition, but I at least expected an immediate answer. Yet this time, unlike before, Kay didn't respond so readily. In a low voice, he hesitated, saying, "I suppose so." I felt a sudden jolt of unease. Chapter 39. Even the next day, and the day after that, Kay's half-hearted response lingered in his behavior. He never once showed any sign of revisiting the issue on his own. Though in fairness, there wasn't much opportunity. Unless the widow and her daughter were both out of the house for the entire day, we couldn't have a calm, unhurried discussion. I understood this well. Yet despite that, I grew increasingly restless. As a result, while I had initially intended to wait for him to speak, I began to feel I should take the initiative if the opportunity arose. At the same time, I quietly observed the behavior of the widow and her daughter, but I noticed no particular difference from their usual demeanor. If nothing had changed in their behavior before and after Kay's confession, then it was safe to conclude that his confession had been meant for me alone, and that neither the main person concerned nor his guardian had any idea. Realizing this gave me some relief. I decided it would be better to wait patiently for a natural opportunity, rather than force the topic artificially. Saying it like this makes it sound easy, but my emotional state rose and fell like the tide. Watching Kay remain motionless, I projected all sorts of meanings onto him. Observing the widow and her daughter's words and actions, I even began to wonder whether their true feelings were really as they appeared. I questioned whether the complex machinery inside the human heart could truly point to emotional truths as clearly and reliably as clock hands on a dial. In the end, I came to rest at this decision, But to be more precise, perhaps rest isn't even the right word. Before long, the new term at school began. On days when our schedules matched, Kay and I left the house together. If convenient, we returned together too. To an outsider, it probably seemed like nothing had changed between us. But inwardly, we were each absorbed in our own thoughts. One day, I confronted Kay directly on the street. My first question was whether his confession had been made only to me, or if it had also been shared with the widow or her daughter. I believed that my next steps would depend entirely on his answer. He clearly stated that he hadn't told anyone else yet. I was secretly pleased. Everything had gone just as I'd suspected. I knew Kay could be more cunning than I was. I also recognized that I lacked his courage. And yet, I still trusted him deeply. Even though he had deceived his foster family about his school expenses for 3 years, that had done nothing to damage my trust in him. In fact, it only strengthened it. So despite being naturally suspicious, I had no urge to doubt his clear answer. I then asked him what he planned to do about his feelings. Was it merely a confession, or did he intend to follow it up with real action? But when it came to this question, he said nothing. He just looked down and walked on in silence. I asked him not to hide anything from me and to speak honestly. He assured me firmly that he had nothing to hide. Yet he gave not a single word in reply to the most critical point. Since we were walking in public, I couldn't very well stop and press him further, so I let it go for the time being. Chapter 40. One day, I went to the school library for the first time in a while. Sitting at a large desk, with sunlight from the window shining across half of my body, I flipped through some newly arrived foreign journals at random. I had been assigned by my professor to research a certain topic in my field of study by the following week. However, I couldn't find what I needed easily and had to borrow and return several journals multiple times. At last, I finally found the article I needed and began reading it with concentration. Suddenly, from across the wide desk, someone called my name in a small voice. I looked up and saw Kay standing there. He leaned over the desk, bringing his face closer to mine. As you know, in a library one cannot speak in a loud voice that would disturb others, so Kay's behavior was nothing out of the ordinary. But for some reason, it gave me a strange feeling that time. Kay asked in a low voice whether I was studying. I replied that I was doing a bit of research. Still, he kept his face close to mine. In the same quiet tone, he asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I said that I might, if he would wait a little. Saying he would wait, he immediately sat down in the empty seat in front of me. Then I found myself distracted and unable to continue reading the journal. It felt as though Kay had something on his mind and had come to confront me about it. I had no choice but to close the journal I had just started reading and stand up. Kay, composed as ever, asked if I was finished. I said it didn't matter, returned the journal, and left the library with him. With nowhere in particular to go, the two of us walked from Tatsuokacho to the edge of the pond and entered Ueno Park. There, Kay abruptly began talking about the matter we both knew of. Judging from the context, it seemed he had deliberately pulled me out for a walk in order to talk about it. However, his attitude still had not advanced at all toward any practical resolution. He vaguely asked me what I thought. What he meant by that was, now that he had fallen into the depths of love, how did I view him? In short, he wanted my judgment of his current self. It was there I clearly recognized a difference from his usual self. I know I repeat myself often, but his nature was not so weak that he would usually care what others thought of him. He was the kind of man who, once convinced of something, would boldly press forward alone. This trait had been strongly imprinted on me during the incident with his foster family. It was only natural, then, that I felt something was different now. When I asked him why he needed my opinion in this matter, he answered in an unusually dejected tone that he was ashamed of being such a weak person. He said he was lost and couldn't understand himself anymore, and that he had no choice but to seek my impartial judgment. I immediately asked what he meant by lost. He explained that he didn't know whether he should advance or retreat. I pressed further. Then if you choose to retreat, are you actually capable of doing so? His words caught in his throat. He only said it was painful. Indeed, the suffering was clearly visible on his face. Had the object of his affection not been the young lady, I might have poured out a reply of comfort over his parched face like gentle rain. I believe I was born with that much kindness and compassion. But at that moment, I was different. Chapter 41. I watched Kei like a person preparing for a duel against a fighter from another school. I readied every part of myself. My eyes, my mind, my body, so that not a single opening remained. Kei, innocent and unguarded, was as exposed as if his fortress's map had been handed to me by his own hand, and I could calmly study it right before his eyes. Seeing him waver between ideals and reality, I focused solely on the fact that I could defeat him in a single blow, and so I exploited his vulnerability at once. I adopted a solemn and formal demeanor toward him. This was, of course, part of my strategy. But I also genuinely felt the tension that suited such a manner. I had no room to feel ridiculous or ashamed. I began by declaring, "A person without spiritual ambition is a fool." These were the very words Kei had once used on me during our trip to Bushu. I repeated them back to him in the same tone he had once used. But it was not revenge. I confessed that my intention was even more cruel than revenge. With that single phrase, I aimed to block the path of love that stretched before him. Kei was born in a Jodo Shinshu temple, but even from his middle school days, his tendencies had never aligned with his family's religious beliefs. I am aware that I am not qualified to speak about doctrinal differences, as I don't know them well. However, at least regarding matters of male-female relationships, I had come to understand him that way. Kei had always liked the word shajin, spiritual discipline. I interpreted it to imply abstinence. Later, when I learned the truth, I was surprised to find that it carried an even stricter meaning. His first and foremost principle was that everything should be sacrificed for the sake of the way. Of course, that included controlling or suppressing desires, and even a love that transcended lust. If it hindered the way, it too had to be discarded. Back when he was living independently, I often heard him express such ideals. Since I had feelings for the young lady at that time, I was inevitably opposed to his beliefs. Whenever I argued, he would always look at me with a pitying expression. But more than pity, what showed on his face was contempt. Given this past, the phrase "a person without spiritual ambition is a fool" must have struck Kei hard. But as I said, I had no intention of mocking the past he had built. Rather, I wanted him to keep building it exactly as he had been. I didn't care whether that path led him to enlightenment or to the heavens. I simply feared that he would suddenly change the direction of his life and come into conflict with my interests. In short, my words were merely the expression of selfishness. A person without spiritual ambition is a fool. I repeated the same phrase a second time. Then I watched to see how those words would affect Kei. "A fool." Kei eventually replied, "I am a fool." He stood still without moving. He stared at the ground. I was startled. In that moment, Kei felt to me like a robber suddenly turning violent. But even so, I noticed that his voice lacked strength. I wanted to judge his feelings from his eyes, but he never once looked at my face. Then slowly, he started walking again. Chapter 42. As I walked beside Kei, I waited silently for his next words. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say I lay in ambush. At the time, I was prepared to strike him with a surprise attack, if necessary. Yet I did have a conscience befitting my education. Had someone come up to me then and whispered, "You're being dishonorable," I might have snapped out of it on the spot. If Kei himself had been that person, I would likely have blushed in shame before him. But Kei was too honest to reproach me. Too simple. Too good-natured. In my blinded state, I forgot to respect those virtues. Instead, I took advantage of them. I exploited them to bring him down. After a short while, Kei called my name and looked at me. This time, I naturally came to a stop, and so did he. At last, I could look straight into his eyes. Since he was taller than me, I had to look up at his face. In that posture, I turned the heart of a wolf toward an innocent lamb. "Let's stop talking about this," he said. There was a strange pain in his voice and eyes. I couldn't respond immediately. Then he repeated, this time as a plea, "Please, let's stop." At that moment, I gave him a cruel reply, like a wolf seizing the lamb's throat when it sees an opening. "Stop? But it wasn't I who brought this up. You're the one who started this conversation. Still, if you want to stop, that's fine. But just saying so won't change anything. Unless you're prepared to stop in your heart. What happened to all those principles you always claimed to live by?" When I said this, Kei seemed to shrink before me, despite his height. Though usually extremely stubborn, he was also deeply honest. Being harshly confronted with his contradictions made it impossible for him to remain unaffected. Seeing his reaction, I finally felt reassured. Then, suddenly, he asked, "Prepared?" Before I could reply, he added, "Prepared? Yes, I suppose I could be prepared." His voice sounded like he was talking to himself, like a man speaking in a dream. With that, our conversation ended, and we headed back toward the lodging in Koishikawa. Though the day was relatively warm and windless, it was still winter, and the park was desolate. When I looked back and saw the reddish-brown cedar trees, stripped of their green by frost, standing tall with their treetops silhouetted against the dim sky, I felt a chill bite at my back. We hurried through the twilight of Hongo Plateau and descended into the Koishikawa Valley to climb the hill on the other side. It was only around then that I began to feel warmth under my coat. Maybe it was because we were walking fast, but on the way back, we barely spoke. At dinner, the lady of the house asked why we had returned so late. I said Kei had invited me to Ueno. She looked surprised and commented on the cold weather. The young lady asked what was in Ueno. I said there was nothing. Just a walk. Kei, who was normally quiet, was even more silent than usual. Even when the lady spoke to him or the young lady smiled at him, he barely responded. He hurriedly shoveled down his meal and left for his room before I had finished eating. Chapter 43. At that time, words like awakening or a new life had not yet come into use. But the reason Kei did not throw away his old self and run straight toward a new direction was not because he lacked the mindset of a modern man. It was because he had a past so sacred that he could not cast it aside. One could even say that he had lived until now for that past. Therefore, just because Kei did not rush headlong toward the object of his love, it does not serve as proof that his love was lukewarm. No matter how fiercely his emotions burned, he could not move recklessly. Unless an impulse so overwhelming as to make him forget everything arose, he had to pause and look back on his past. And once he did that, he was forced to walk the same path it pointed to. Furthermore, he possessed a stubbornness and endurance that modern people do not have. I believed I understood his heart well on both of these points. That evening after we returned from Ueno was a relatively calm night for me. I followed Kei back to his room and sat down beside his desk. I deliberately started some idle small talk. He seemed annoyed. Perhaps there was a glimmer of triumph in my eyes, and my voice certainly had a tone of pride in it. After we had warmed our hands over the same brazier for a while, I returned to my own room. In everything else I could never surpass him, but in that moment alone, I felt I had no reason to fear him. Before long, I fell into a peaceful sleep, but suddenly I was awakened by the sound of my name being called. I looked and saw the sliding door between our rooms open about 2 feet, with Kei's dark silhouette standing there. In his room, the lamp was still burning just as it had been in the evening. The world had suddenly changed for me, and I sat there stunned, unable to speak, just staring at that scene. Kay asked if I was already asleep. He was a man who always stayed up late. I asked back if he needed something. He replied that it was nothing important. He had just wondered if I was asleep or still awake and decided to ask while on his way to the toilet. With the lamp behind him, I could not make out his expression or the look in his eyes. However, his voice was actually calmer than usual. Soon after, Kay shut the door tightly. My room returned to darkness. I closed my eyes again to seek dreams as quiet as that darkness. I remember nothing after that. But the next morning, when I thought about the events of the previous evening, something felt strange. I began to wonder if it had all been a dream. So during breakfast, I asked Kay. He said that he had indeed opened the door and called my name. When I asked why he did so, he gave no clear answer. Later, in a disconnected tone, he asked whether I had been able to sleep soundly lately. I found it odd. That day, our class schedules happened to start at the same time, so we left the house together. Still concerned about what had happened the night before, I pressed Kay again on the way. But Kay still did not give a satisfying answer. I asked if he had meant to talk to me about something. Kay firmly denied it. He seemed to remind me that he had already said, "Let's not talk about this anymore," the previous day at Ueno. He was a man with a sharp pride in such matters. Suddenly, I recalled the word resolve he had used. That word, which until now had meant little to me, began to weigh heavily on my mind. Chapter 44. I knew well that Kay had a bold and decisive nature, and I fully understood why he alone seemed indecisive in this matter. I had taken pride in grasping the exception based on understanding the general. However, as I kept mulling over the word, resolve, in my mind, my confidence began to fade and waver. I started to wonder if perhaps this case wasn't an exception for Kay after all. Could it be that he had already determined the final means to resolve all his doubts, anguish, and inner torment at once? As I reconsidered that word in this new light, I was startled. Had I, at that moment, viewed the meaning behind his use of resolve fairly, that might have been better. But sadly, I was blind in one eye. I interpreted the words solely to mean that he was prepared to pursue the young lady. I became convinced that his resolute nature would now be shown in the domain of love. I heard a voice in my heart saying that I, too, must make a final decision. I responded to that voice and summoned my courage. I resolved that I must act before Kay and do so without his knowledge. I waited silently for an opportunity, but even after 2 or 3 days passed, I could not find one. I hoped to speak with the widow while Kay and the daughter were out. But whenever one of them was absent, the other was around, and I couldn't find a suitable moment. I grew impatient. After a week, I could stand it no longer and feigned illness. Though urged by the widow, the daughter, and even Kay himself to get up, I gave vague answers and stayed in bed until around 10. Once both Kay and the daughter had left and the house was quiet, I got up. The widow, seeing me, immediately asked what was wrong. She kindly offered to bring my food to the bedside and advised me to rest more. But since I was not truly ill, I couldn't stay in bed. I washed my face and ate in the usual room. The widow sat across the brazier and served me. As I sat there with my rice bowl, unsure how to broach the subject, I probably looked convincingly like a sick man, preoccupied as I was. After finishing my meal, I lit a cigarette. Since I didn't get up, the widow stayed by the brazier, calling the maid to clear the table, adding water to the iron kettle, and wiping the brazier's edge to match my pace. I asked her if she had something special she needed to do. She said no, and then asked why. I told her there was something I wanted to talk about. She said, "What is it?" and looked at me. Her tone was too light to match my mood, so I hesitated with my next words. Having no choice, I fumbled around the subject and finally asked if Kay had said anything recently. The widow looked surprised and replied, "About what?" And before I could answer, she asked. Did he say something to you? Chapter 45. After I had said, no, not intending to relay Kay's confession to the widow, I immediately felt uncomfortable about my lie. So I corrected myself, saying that Kay hadn't asked me to relay anything and that it wasn't about him. The widow said, I see, and waited. I had no choice but to speak. I suddenly said, please give me your daughter. The widow did not seem as surprised as I had expected, though she did look at me in silence for a moment. Once I had said it, no amount of staring could make me flinch. Please give her to me. I ask you sincerely. I repeated, as my wife, please give her to me. Being older, the widow was much calmer than I was. I don't mind giving her, but isn't this rather sudden? She asked. When I replied, I want to marry her immediately. She burst into laughter. Then she asked, have you thought this through? I explained firmly that though the proposal may seem sudden, my decision was not. We exchanged a few more words, but I have since forgotten them. The widow, who had a forthrightness rare among women, was someone with whom one could have a straightforward conversation in situations like this. Very well, she said, I will give her to you. Then she added, though I say give, I am not in a position to boast. Please, take her. As you know, she is a poor girl without a father. The conversation ended simply and clearly. It probably didn't take more than 15 minutes. The widow mentioned no conditions. She said there was no need to consult any relatives. If they objected later, they could simply retract it. She clearly stated that there was no need to check the girl's opinion either. On such matters, the educated me seemed more attached to formalities. When I pointed out that, at the very least, we should speak to the young lady and get her consent first, the widow said, don't worry, I would never give her to someone she didn't want. Back in my room, I felt oddly unsettled by how smoothly everything had gone. I even began to wonder if things were truly going to be all right. Still, on the whole, the idea that my future was now determined gave me a renewed sense of self. Around noon, I returned to the main room and asked the widow when she planned to tell her daughter. She replied that if she herself had agreed, then it didn't matter when she told her. At this point, it felt like she was more of a man than I was, so I decided to leave it at that. But then the widow stopped me and said that if I preferred it sooner, she could tell her today, right after she returned from her lesson. I said that would be best and went back to my room. But the thought of sitting silently at my desk while listening to their hushed conversation from afar made me feel uneasy. I finally put on my hat and went outside. There, at the bottom of the hill, I happened to run into the daughter. Unaware of anything, she looked surprised to see me. When I took off my hat and asked, "Are you just getting back?" she replied with a puzzled expression, "Oh, are you already feeling better?" I answered, "Yes, I'm all better," and turned quickly towards Suidobashi. Chapter 46. I walked from Saragukucho out to the street in Jimbocho, then turned toward Agawamaki. I usually strolled around this neighborhood to browse the secondhand bookstores, but that day, I had no interest in looking at books lined up under the eaves. As I walked, I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening at home. I still remembered the wife from earlier. I also imagined what might be happening after the young lady had returned home. In essence, it was these two thoughts that propelled my steps. More than that, I would occasionally stop in the middle of the street without even realizing it. I would stand there and think, by now, the wife is probably telling her daughter about it. At other times, I thought, she's probably already finished talking to her. Eventually, I crossed Mansibashi, climbed the hill to Myojin, walked up to Hongo Plateau, then descended Kikuzuka, and finally came down into the Koishikawa Valley. My path spanned 3 wards, tracing an irregular circle, one might say. Yet during this long walk, I hardly thought about Kei at all. Looking back on it now, I cannot understand why. I only find it strange. Perhaps my mind was so tightly focused in one direction that it left no room for Kei. But even then, my conscience should not have allowed it. My conscience toward Kei returned the moment I opened the lattice gate at home and passed through the entryway into the sitting room. Just as I was about to go through his room as always. He was sitting at his desk reading, just like usual. He looked up from his book and glanced at me, also just like usual. But unlike usual, he didn't ask, just got back. Instead, he said, "Are you feeling better? Did you go to the doctor?" In that instant, I wanted to kneel before him and beg forgiveness. The impulse I felt at that moment was far from weak. Had we been alone in the middle of a vast, empty field, I surely would have followed my conscience and apologized right then and there. But someone was in the next room. That presence stopped me in my tracks. And tragically, that impulse never returned. At dinner, Kei and I met again, unaware of anything. Kei was simply quiet and did not look at me with any suspicion. Unaware of anything, the wife seemed happier than usual. I was the only one who knew everything. I ate my meal like it was made of lead. The young lady, as usual, did not sit at the table with us. When the wife called for her, she only responded with a quick, "I'm coming." From the next room, Kei looked puzzled. Eventually, he asked the wife what was going on. The wife said she was probably just feeling awkward and glanced at me briefly. Kei, still puzzled, pressed her. Why would she feel awkward? The wife smiled slightly and looked at me again. From the start of the meal, I had suspected from the wife's expression how things had played out, but I couldn't bear the thought of her openly explaining everything to Kei right there in front of me. The wife was the kind of person who could do such a thing without hesitation, so I was on edge. Fortunately, Kei returned to his usual silence. Though the wife seemed to be in a better mood than usual, she didn't go so far as to say what I feared she might. I let out a small sigh of relief and returned to my room. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about how I should behave toward Kei from then on. I tried to come up with excuses in my own mind, but none of them could withstand facing him directly. In the end, I was too cowardly to explain myself to Kei. Chapter 47. I spent another 2 or 3 days like that. During that time, an unrelenting unease about Kei weighed heavily on me. Even under ordinary circumstances, I felt I owed him something. On top of that, the wife's manner and the young lady's behavior constantly pricked at me like needles. It was agonizing. The wife had a somewhat manly spirit. There was no guarantee she wouldn't casually bring everything up at the dinner table. The young lady's actions, especially the way she began behaving toward me so noticeably, might arouse suspicion in Kei. I found myself in a position where I had to tell Kei about the new relationship that had formed between me and the family. Yet, being someone who recognized my own moral weakness, I felt it was almost impossible to do so. I thought maybe I could ask the wife to explain things to Kei on my behalf. Of course, only when I wasn't around. But if she told him the plain truth, the only difference would be in whether it was told directly or indirectly. Either way, I would still be disgraced. And if I asked her to make something up, she would surely demand a reason. If I wanted to entrust her with the task, I'd have to confess everything to her. That would mean exposing my weakness to both my lover and her mother. For someone as serious as me, that felt like putting my future trustworthiness at risk. Losing even a shred of trust from my future wife before marriage seemed like a devastating misfortune. In short, I was a fool who, though intending to walk the honest path, slipped and fell. Or perhaps I was a cunning man, but the only ones aware of that were heaven and my own heart. Still, to take another step forward, I would have to let those around me know I had fallen. That was the dilemma I faced. I desperately wanted to hide my fall, and yet I couldn't help but move forward. Caught in this contradiction, I froze again. 5 or 6 days later, The wife suddenly asked me if I had told Kay about the matter. I replied that I hadn't. Then she pressed me. Why haven't you told him? I became stiff before the question. I still remember the words that startled me then. No wonder he made a strange face when I told him. You're not being fair. You two are always so close, and now you're just pretending like nothing's happened. I asked the wife if Kay had said anything in response. She said he hadn't said anything particular, but I had to press her for more details. She, having nothing to hide, explained Kay's reaction thoroughly. Putting everything she said together, it seemed that Kay had received this final blow with a surprisingly calm sort of shock. When the wife told him about the new relationship between me and the young lady, he simply said, "Is that so?" But when she added, "You should be happy for them," he finally looked at her and, with a faint smile, said, "Congratulations," then stood up. As he was about to open the sliding door to the sitting room, he turned back and asked, "When is the wedding?" He then added, "I'd like to give a gift, but I don't have any money." Sitting there before the wife, hearing that story, I felt as if my chest was being crushed with pain. Chapter 48. By my calculations, it had been over 2 days since the wife spoke to Kay. During that time, he behaved no differently toward me than he had before. I hadn't noticed anything. I thought his calm demeanor, even if only on the surface, was admirable. When I compared the two of us in my mind, he seemed far more dignified than I. The feeling that I may have won by scheme, but as a human being I lost, churned within my chest. I thought to myself that Kay must surely be looking down on me, and I blushed in shame. Yet I couldn't bear to show my face to him and be humiliated. That would be too painful for my pride. On Saturday night, I decided to wait until the next day to act, still unsure whether to move forward or stay still. But that night, Kay committed suicide. Even now, the memory of that scene makes me shudder. I usually slept with my head to the east, but that night, by coincidence, I laid out my bedding with my head to the west. Perhaps it was fate. I was awakened by a cold draft blowing across my pillow. Looking up, I saw the sliding partition between Kay's room and mine open to about the same width as it had been that other night. But unlike then, Kay's dark silhouette was not standing there. As though prompted by some premonition, I propped myself up on my elbow and stared into his room. The lamp was dimly lit. The bedding was laid out, but the quilt was tossed back and crumpled near the foot, and Kay was lying face down on the floor. I called out, "Hey," but got no reply. "Hey, what's wrong?" I called again. Still, his body didn't move at all. I got up at once and walked to the threshold. From there, I looked around his room in the faint lamplight. My first sensation was almost exactly like when Kay had confessed his love to me. As soon as I took in the room at a glance, my eyes froze, as if they had turned to glass. Lifeless and unmoving, I stood paralyzed. When that sudden shock swept through me like a gust of wind, I thought, "It's too late." A black light of finality pierced my future, casting a ghastly glow over my entire life ahead. I began to tremble uncontrollably. Still, I couldn't forget myself entirely. I immediately focused on the letter on the desk. As expected, it was addressed to me. I tore it open in a daze, but nothing inside matched what I had feared. I had expected harsh accusations, painful words. I was afraid that if the wife or young lady saw them, they would be filled with contempt. Just glancing over the letter, I felt relieved. Of course, it was only a superficial relief, but in that moment, appearances were of tremendous importance to me. The contents were brief and abstract. He wrote that he was too weak-willed to have any hope for the future and had decided to take his own life. He added a few lines of thanks for my past kindness in very plain words. He asked me, as a final favor, to handle the affairs after his death. He also asked me to offer his apologies to the wife for the trouble. He requested that I notify his family back home. All the necessary details were covered in a few words, and yet nowhere in the letter did he mention the young lady. By the end, I realized he had deliberately avoided the subject. But what struck me most painfully was a line at the end, written as if in leftover ink. I should have died sooner. Why did I live until now? With trembling hands, I rolled the letter back up and placed it back in the envelope. I deliberately left it on the desk where everyone could see it, just as it had been. Then I turned around and, for the first time, noticed the blood spurting onto the sliding door. Chapter 49. I suddenly placed both hands around Kei's head and slightly lifted it. I wanted to see his dead face, but when I peered at his face from underneath, since he was lying face down, I immediately let go. It wasn't only that I was horrified. It was that his head felt incredibly heavy. I gazed for a while at the cold ear I had just touched and the close-cropped hair that was as thick as ever. I didn't feel like crying at all. I was simply terrified. And that terror wasn't just a simple sensory reaction to the scene before me. I deeply felt the horror of fate, hinted at by my friend who had so suddenly gone cold. Without any clear thought, I returned to my room and began pacing in circles around the 8-mat room. My head commanded me to keep moving aimlessly. I felt I had to do something. Yet at the same time, I knew there was nothing I could do. I couldn't stop circling the room, like a bear caged in a zoo. At times I felt like going to the back to wake the lady of the house. But the thought of showing this terrifying scene to a woman immediately stopped me, especially with the young lady. It was absolutely unthinkable to frighten her. That strong will kept me from doing so, and so I began pacing again. During that time, I lit the lamp in my room. I checked the clock from time to time. No clock had ever moved more slowly or more uselessly. I don't remember the exact time I awoke, but it was clear that dawn was not far off. As I waited, pacing and longing for the break of day, I was haunted by the thought that perhaps this dark night would last forever. We had a habit of getting up before 7. Since school often started at 8, we had to do so to be on time. The maid usually rose around 6. But that day, I went to wake her even before 6. The lady of the house, hearing my footsteps, told me it was Sunday. I asked her, since she was awake, if she could come to my room for a moment. She threw on a casual coat over her sleepwear and followed me. As soon as we entered, I slid shut the partitioning fusama that had been open until then and told her in a low voice that something terrible had happened. She asked what it was. I motioned toward the neighboring room with my chin and said, "Please don't be alarmed." Her face went pale. "Madam, Kei has taken his own life." I added. She stood frozen, staring at me in silence. Then, suddenly, I bowed before her and placed my hands on the floor. "I'm sorry. It was my fault. I've caused trouble for both you and your daughter." I apologized. Until I faced her, I had no intention of saying such words. But upon seeing her face, I blurted them out without realizing. Unable to apologize to Kei, I felt compelled to apologize to her and her daughter instead. My natural instinct had overpowered my usual self, forcing open the mouth of confession. Fortunately, she didn't read any deeper meaning into my words. With a pale face, she said kindly, "If it was an accident, then there's nothing to be done." But her face, carved with fear and shock, was stiff and strained. Chapter 50. Though I felt sorry for her, I stood up again and opened the fusuma I had just closed. Kei's lamp seemed to have run out of oil, and the room was nearly pitch dark. I went back, picked up my own lamp, and stood in the doorway, glancing back at her. She peeked into the format room from behind me, trying to hide herself, but she made no move to enter. She told me to leave it as it was and to open the shutters. After that, her demeanor was composed and efficient, as one might expect of a military widow. I went to the doctor and to the police, but all on her instruction. Until the necessary procedures were complete, she allowed no one to enter Kei's room. Kei had used a small knife to cut his carotid artery and died instantly. There were no other visible wounds. The blood I had seen soaking the paper screen in the dim lamplight had clearly gushed out all at once from his neck. I later examined the traces of it again in daylight and was stunned by the intensity of human blood's force. The lady and I cleaned Kei's room as thoroughly and skillfully as we could. Fortunately, most of the blood had soaked into his futon, so the tatami mat was not too badly stained, making the cleanup more manageable. We moved his body into my room and laid him out as if he were simply asleep, just as he usually looked. Then I went out to send a telegram to his family. When I returned, incense had already been lit at Kei's pillow. The scent hit my nose the moment I stepped in. In the smoke, I saw two women seated. This was the first time I had seen the young lady's face since the night before. She was crying. The lady's eyes were red, too. Since the incident, I had forgotten how to cry, but now I was finally drawn into a feeling of sorrow. My heart, clenched by fear and pain, was gently loosened by that sadness. It gave me the first drop of relief. I sat silently beside the two. The lady told me to offer incense as well, so I did and sat again in silence. The young lady said nothing to me. Occasionally, she exchanged a few words with her mother, but only regarding practical matters. She wasn't yet in a state to speak of Kei's life. Still, I was grateful that she had been spared the terrifying scene from the night before. I feared that showing such horror to someone young and beautiful might destroy that beauty. Even when my own fear had reached the ends of my hair, I couldn't bring myself to act in a way that would expose her to it. It would have been like whipping a beautiful, innocent flower. I found that thought unbearably unpleasant. When Kei's father and elder brother came from the countryside, I offered my opinion about where to bury him. I remembered how Kei and I often took walks near Zashigaya. He had liked the area very much. I even jokingly said, "If you love it so much, I'll bury you here if you die." Now I wasn't sure what kind of merit there was in actually fulfilling that old joke, but I wanted to kneel before his grave month after month and renew my confession. Perhaps because I had taken care of everything, they accepted my suggestion, and we buried Kei in Zashigaya.
Chapter 51 On the way back from Keiichiju in Yofe's funeral, one of his friends asked me why Kei had taken his own life. Ever since the incident, I had been tormented by this question countless times. The lady, the young woman, Keiichiju in Yofe's family, acquaintances WHO had been notified. Even unrelated journalists, none of them failed to ask me this. Every time, my conscience was pierced like a needle. And each time, I seemed to hear a hidden voice behind the question, "Ichiju in Yofu, go ahead. Admit that you killed him, Ichiju in Yofu." My answer was always the same. I repeated only what Kei had written in the letter addressed to me and added nothing more. The friend WHO questioned me after the funeral, pulled a newspaper from his pocket and showed it to me. Walking alongside him, I read the section he indicated. It claimed Kei had become despondent and committed suicide after being disowned by his family. I said nothing, folded the paper, and handed it back. The friend also mentioned another article suggesting K had gone mad and killed himself. Busy as I was, I each in of the had little time to read the news, but I had been deeply concerned about what might appear. I especially dreaded anything that might involve the young lady, even just her name. I asked the friend if there had been anything else written. He said he had only seen those 2 reports. Soon after, we moved to the house I live in now. The lady and her daughter didn't each in often want to stay in the old place, and I too found it painful to relive that night every evening. We discussed it and agreed to move. About 2 months later, I graduated from university. Less than half a year after that, I finally married the young lady. From the outside, it looked like everything had gone according to plan, so it must have seemed like a happy ending. The lady and her daughter looked truly happy. I was happy too. But my happiness was shadowed. I feared that it might be the beliefs that would eventually lead me to a tragic fate. After we married, so she was no longer a young lady, but my wife. She suddenly suggested one day that we visit KH in office grave. I was startled for no reason. I asked her why she suddenly thought of it. She said K would surely be pleased to see us visiting together. I gazed at her innocent face intently. When she asked why I looked at her that way, I finally realized what I was doing. I went with her, as she wished, to the Shigaya. I washed KH in office new grave with water. She placed incense and flowers before it. We bowed and put our hands together in prayer. She was probably telling K how we had come to be married, hoping he would be happy for us. I, in my heart, could only repeat, "I'm sorry." My wife praised the grave, saying it was impressive. It wasn't in often anything extraordinary, but because I had personally gone to the stonemason and chosen it, she probably wanted to say something nice. As I compared the new grave, my new wife, and KH in office new white bones buried beneath the earth, I couldn't in often help but feel the cold ridicule of fate. Since then, I have never again visited KH in office grave with my wife.
Chapter 52. My feelings toward my deceased friend continued on like this indefinitely. In fact, I had feared this from the very beginning. You could even say that I held our wedding, something I had long wished for, in a state of unease. But since I was a man who could not see into his own future, I also thought that perhaps this could become a turning point to shift my feelings and lead me into a new life. However, once I actually became a husband and saw my wife every morning and evening, that faint hope was mercilessly destroyed by harsh reality. The more time I spent with my wife, the more I suddenly found myself haunted by Kay. It was as though my wife stood in between and bound Kay and me together, refusing to separate us. Since I could find no fault in her at all, I only wished to distance her from me for this single reason. That sentiment immediately reflected in her heart. She sensed it, but she didn't understand why. She would sometimes press me, asking why I looked so troubled or if something was bothering me. If I laughed it off, that was fine, but sometimes her irritation would grow. Eventually, I had to hear her accuse me, saying, "You must hate me." Or, "You're hiding something from me, aren't you?" Each time, I suffered. There were many times I seriously considered just confessing everything to her. But at the very moment of doing so, some force outside myself would suddenly rise and suppress me. Knowing you understand me, there's probably no need to explain. But since I should speak frankly, I will. At that time, I had no desire to embellish myself in front of my wife. Had I spoken with the same sincerity I had for my late friend, she would surely have shed tears of joy and forgiven my sin. I had no selfish calculations or gains in mind by not confessing. I simply couldn't bear to mark her memory with a dark spot. Please understand that for me, to splash even a drop of ink on something pure white was excruciatingly painful. Even after a year, I couldn't forget Kay, and my heart was constantly anxious. To drive this anxiety away, I tried to lose myself in books. I threw myself into study with great force and waited for the day I could present its results to the world. But to fabricate a goal and force myself to wait for its attainment was a lie, and it became unpleasant. I could no longer bury myself in books. Once again, I folded my arms and looked out at the world. My wife seemed to observe that I was becoming idle because I didn't suffer from any immediate hardship. Her family had enough wealth for 2 people to live modestly, and I was in a position where I didn't need to seek work. So, her conclusion was natural. Perhaps I had been somewhat spoiled, but the real reason I had grown stagnant did not lie there. After being deceived by my uncle, I had come to deeply realize that people could not be trusted. Still, even then, I believed I was different, that I was a decent human being. But Kay destroyed that belief. When I came to the realization that I was no different from my uncle, I suddenly lost my footing. Disillusioned with others, I now became disillusioned with myself, and could no longer move. Chapter 53. Unable to bury myself in books, I even went through a phase where I tried to drown my soul in alcohol to forget myself. I wouldn't say I liked drinking, but I could drink when I did. So, I relied on quantity to try and dull my heart. But this shallow tactic only made me more misanthropic in time. In the midst of being drunk, I would suddenly become aware of my position. I'd realize I was deliberately playing the fool to deceive myself. Then, with a shudder, both my eyes and heart would awaken. Sometimes, I couldn't even achieve that drunk, masked state and just sank into misery for no reason. And after this artificial pleasure always came a depressing recoil. I had to show that side of me to the person I loved most, my wife, and to her mother, and yet they interpreted me in their own way, from their natural perspective. My mother-in-law would occasionally say awkward things to my wife. My wife would keep them from me, but it seemed she still felt the need to blame me directly. Even so, her reproaches were never harsh. There were almost no times I got angry at her words. She often asked me to speak openly if something bothered me. She also advised me to stop drinking for my own future. Once, she even cried and said, "You've changed lately." That alone would have been fine, but then she added, "If Kay were still alive, you wouldn't be like this." I once replied, "That may be true." But the meaning I intended and the meaning she understood were completely different. And that saddened me deeply. Even then, I couldn't bring myself to explain anything to her. I sometimes apologized to my wife. Usually, it was the morning after I returned home late and drunk. She would smile, or say nothing. Occasionally, she would silently weep. No matter how she responded, I always felt unbearable discomfort. Apologizing to her was, in effect, apologizing to myself. Eventually, I quit drinking, not so much because of her advice, but because I grew tired of it myself. I stopped drinking, but I still had no desire to do anything. With nothing else to do, I read books. But whatever I read, I left unfinished. My wife often asked what I was studying for. I only gave a wry smile. But deep down, The thought that even the one person I loved and trusted most in the world didn't understand me made me unbearably sad. And the fact that I had the means to make her understand, but lacked the courage to do so made me even sadder. I was lonely. I often felt as though I had been cut off from everything and lived alone in this world. At the same time, I repeatedly thought about the cause of Kei's death. At the time, my mind was completely dominated by the idea of love, so my interpretation was overly simple and straightforward. I concluded that Kei had taken his life because of unrequited love. But as time passed and I viewed the same event with a calmer mind, I began to feel that it wasn't so easily resolved. The conflict between reality and ideals. No, even that explanation wasn't enough. I began to suspect that perhaps Kei, like me, found himself unbearably lonely, and that it was this loneliness which drove him to take his life. And that realization chilled me. At times, I felt like I too was treading the same path Kei had walked. Chapter 54. Not long after, my wife's mother fell ill. The doctor said it was beyond hope. I devoted myself to nursing her as best I could. This was not only for the sake of the patient herself, but also for the wife I loved. But in a larger sense, it was for humanity. I had always felt an intense urge to do something, but with nothing to do, I had been left with no choice but to stand with my hands in my pockets. For someone cut off from the world, this was the first time I had consciously reached out and done even a small good deed. I was gripped by a feeling that could only be described as a kind of atonement. The mother died. My wife and I were left alone. She told me that from now on, I was the only one she could rely on in this world. Unable even to rely on myself, I looked at her face and was overcome with emotion. I felt she was a truly unfortunate woman. I even said it aloud. She asked why. She couldn't understand what I meant. Nor could I explain it. She wept. She accused me of being twisted and of always looking at her with a warped perspective. After her mother passed, I treated my wife with as much kindness as I could. Not only because I loved her, but also because my kindness seemed to come from a broader, impersonal sense of morality, much like when I had cared for her mother. My wife appeared content, but even within that contentment, there seemed to be a vague, faint dissatisfaction stemming from her inability to understand me. Yet even if she had understood me, I doubt that dissatisfaction would have diminished. Women, it seems, value kindness directed solely at them. More than a grand, moral sort of love. Even if it involves a bit of impropriety. One day, she asked me, "Can a man's heart and a woman's heart ever truly become one?" I gave her an ambiguous answer. Perhaps when they're young. She seemed to be reflecting on her past, and then she let out a faint sigh. Around that time, terrifying shadows began to flash through my mind. At first, they came from outside, suddenly attacking. I was startled. I was horrified. But before long, my heart began to respond to those terrifying flashes. Eventually, they no longer needed to come from outside. It felt as though they had been hiding inside me since birth. Each time I felt this way, I questioned whether there was something wrong with my mind. But I never felt inclined to see a doctor or consult anyone. I simply felt the weight of human guilt. Deeply, that feeling compelled me to visit Kei's grave every month. It compelled me to care for my wife's mother, and it compelled me to be kind to my wife. At one point, the feeling was so strong, I even wished to be whipped by a stranger on the roadside. As I progressed step by step along this path, I eventually came to feel that it was not others who should whip me, but I myself. And from there arose the thought that I should not merely whip myself, but kill myself. With no other option, I resolved to live as though I were already dead. How many years has it been since I made that decision? My wife and I have lived together peacefully, just as before. We are not unhappy. We are happy. But that one point, so heavy and inescapable for me. always seemed a dark, unknowable thing to my wife. And when I think of that, I feel deeply sorry for her. Chapter 55. Having resolved to live as though I were already dead, my heart would still at times leap up in response to stimuli from the outside world. But the moment I decided to set out in some new direction, a terrifying power would emerge from somewhere, gripping my heart tightly, preventing me from moving even a little. That force would then speak to me, suppressing me with the words, "You are a man who has no right to do anything." With that single statement, I would collapse in defeat. After a while, I would try to rise again, only to be gripped once more. Clenching my teeth, I would shout in anger, "Why are you interfering with me?" That mysterious power would laugh coldly and say, "You know the reason well enough yourself." And I would fall limp once again. Please understand that, despite leading a monotonous life with no upheaval or twists, I was constantly engaged in this kind of painful inner battle. Long before my wife ever grew impatient with me, I myself had suffered through countless layers of frustration. When I could no longer bear staying trapped inside this prison, and yet also found myself utterly incapable of breaking free from it, I began to feel that the only path I could follow to the end with ease was suicide. You may be shocked and widen your eyes at this, but the same mysterious and terrifying force that constantly stifled my will to act left open only the road to death as free and available to me. As long as I remained motionless, I could manage. But the moment I tried to move, there was nowhere for me to go but down that path. Up until today, I have already tried 2 or 3 times to follow the path that fate seemed to be leading me down with the least resistance. But each time, I was held back by my feelings for my wife. Of course, I had no courage to take her with me. I was a man incapable of even revealing everything to her, so the idea of making her a victim of my destiny and robbing her of her natural lifespan was horrifying to even consider. Just as I had my fate, so too did she have her own. To tie the two of us into a bundle and burn us together seemed, from any reasonable perspective, an unbearably cruel and extreme idea. At the same time, when I imagined the wife I would leave behind, I was struck with deep pity. I could never forget how she had once confessed, after her mother's death, that I was now the only one she could rely on in the world. That memory sank deep into my soul. I always hesitated. At times I would look at her face and feel grateful I hadn't gone through with it. And so I would remain paralyzed once more, unable to act. Then she would look at me occasionally with eyes that seemed to say she found something lacking in me. Please remember this. This is how I have lived. Even when I first met you in Kamakura, even when we strolled together through the suburbs, my mood had not changed. There was always a dark shadow clinging to my back. It was as if I were dragging my life along behind me solely for the sake of my wife. The same was true when you graduated and returned home. When I promised we would meet again in September, I was not lying. I truly intended to see you. Even as autumn passed and winter came and went, I fully meant to meet you again. Then, in the height of summer, Emperor Meiji passed away. At that moment, I felt as though the spirit of Meiji had begun and ended with the emperor himself. For those of us who had been most deeply influenced by the Meiji era, our continued existence felt like a relic of a time now past. That feeling struck me with painful force. I told my wife plainly. She laughed and dismissed it, but then, perhaps thinking something, she teasingly said to me, "Then why not commit Junsure?"